Well, good day and welcome to SOP, Save Our Planet. My name is Gary Willing. I hope you're having a wonderful day wherever you are. Now, I always do a couple things before I start. The most important thing that anybody can do, and this includes you who are listening to this, after listening to this video is to take some time out of your day and do a little reading, do a little research, look into this. If you go to the Share International site, there's a link to that website in the description portion of this video. That website has the best background information about Maitreya, about miracles and signs that have been going on. And you might even heard of a few of these miracles and signs, but you didn't realize that there were other miracles and signs that were related to that. So, look into that and study it in that way and take that perspective and see what you get. But you can also get a better understanding about why peace is so important by just going to that website. So hopefully you'll look into it. The information is wonderful and it's also free. The next thing I'm hoping that you do is to join the discussion. Everybody and anybody has an opinion. Let me know what you think. Post a comment. And I get wonderful comments all the time, even people who disagree with what I have to say. That's fine. Post your comment. If you have a question you want to ask me or you need clarification on something that I've said or something that you've read about Maitreya, post your question in the comment section. I'll answer it in another video. Or email me, searchforsigns@mail.com. Now, I put up quite a few videos over the last week, and I got some wonderful comments, and I had some questions that came my way. I'm going to address and try to answer the question that I get the most, and then there's a question that I've never gotten before, and I don't know if I'll answer it quite right, so we'll try to tackle that one too. But what question do I get more than any other question? Wait for it. The question is Maitreya the Antichrist? Now, I have to laugh a little bit because the person asked the question twice on a video that was about 2.5, 3 minutes long, and if they had just listened to the video all the way through, they would have gotten my answer. You know what I mean? But okay, but I'll try to answer it nonetheless. Is Maitreya the Antichrist? The simplest answer is no. He is not the Antichrist. And then if you were to go on and ask the question, is Donald Trump the Antichrist? I think he looks more like an Antichrist figure than Maitreya, but the answer to that question would be no, he's not the Antichrist. Does he have his own issues? Is he very destructive in the world? That is, my opinion might differ from yours, but no, he's not the Antichrist. Is Obama the Antichrist? No. Is King Charles the Antichrist? No. Is the new Pope or Pope Francis, was he the Antichrist? No, and no. And these are just individuals that have kind of been in the spotlight over the past few years who people have labeled as being the Antichrist. Even though they've never seen Maitreya on TV and recognized him, never heard a single thing that he said, they are utterly convinced that he's the Antichrist. But to me, I would wait and reserve my judgment until after I actually literally saw him on TV, but, be that as it may. The Antichrist, and this is the simplest answer to this question about what is the Antichrist is an energy. And it's, here and wait for it, it's purposefully sent out into the world. It actually has a purpose and a function. And what is that purpose and that function? I'm going to try to answer. But the Antichrist is an energy. And I know it's very misinterpreted, or it's actually, I take that back. Before I say it's misinterpreted, it's interpreted to be an individual. And people look into on their TV, on the internet, trying to find the Antichrist. And they've done this for a very long time. They've even done it before TV and the internet, actually. And believe it or not, every century has a generation of people who believe that they are living during the end times. And we're looking for the Antichrist and talking about who this person could be as the Antichrist and so forth and so forth and so forth. It's always based on fear, perhaps paranoia, and prejudice. And it's always somebody who's different than them. But invariably, every time somebody has thought that they've been living during the end times, it wasn't the end times because yet we're still here. So this time is no different. There are a lot more people talking about the end times because we have global communication and the internet. It does create a very strong and controlling and destructive thought form to think that, because it generates fear, it keeps people stuck. And also this thought form about who and what an Antichrist figure to be, when they label that person as the Antichrist, that also creates fear and a thought form and of destruction or whatever. It also when it comes to political figures like Donald Trump, it resigns them to believe that there's nothing they can do. They have no way to effectively change that person, or whatever, right? Or defeat that person politically. They're just kind of resigned to the fact that, oh, he's the Antichrist, there's nothing I can do. Well, that's not true either, It doesn't mean that there aren't people out there who are very destructive, deeply evil, very greedy, and are creating a great deal of harm. But those people can't even be said to be the Antichrist. But what is the Antichrist, and what was the purpose of releasing this energy? Well, the Antichrist energy, from the Ageless Wisdom point of view, has already been released twice. One time through an individual, and the other time through a group. And there's a reason why it was first released to an individual and the second time through a group. And then, according to the Ageless Wisdom teachings, there will be a third time that the Antichrist energy will be released again, but it's so far into the future that none of us who are listening to this video will be alive when it happens, because it's about 3,000 or so years from now. Now, one of the great misinterpretations in the Bible was the length of time that Moses was talking about the creation of the universe and the world in Genesis, when they view it as 7 calendar days, when in reality it was billions upon billions of years of a creation of what we would consider the universe to be. It's the same thing when it comes to the book of Revelation. The time frame in which most people are thinking John was talking about was just a few months or a few years, when in actuality he was talking about a time frame of about 5,000 or so years. Quite a bit different in terms of what most people think. So the first time the Antichrist energy was released was during the time that John was actually writing Revelation. And it was released through Emperor Nero, who historians have credited to really be the catalyst for the destruction of the Roman dispensation. Now, I don't think Rome was truly destroyed. I think it transformed into the church. But even then, it would have never flourished and grown in the way that it did over the last 2,000 years had it not been for the destruction of the Roman Empire. So that energy did its work. And so for the last 2,000 years, there's a lot more historically written over the last 2,000 years than the prior 2,000 years. So we don't really have a true understanding of the evolution of consciousness prior to that, just bits and fragments. But if we could go back to prior to the time of Nero, we would not be able to relate with people, even if we could speak their own language and they could understand us. We would not understand why they think the way that they think. They would have no concept of the words or the concepts that you take to be easy to understand. They would have no concept of that, because they couldn't even really think for themselves at all. And the individuals that could think for themselves, that truly saw themselves as individual, ruled everybody. And it was very easy for them to manipulate the public opinion, because people couldn't think for themselves as they do today. It's much harder for people of power to manipulate people. They have to come up with different and better creative ways of doing it, because we are starting to think for ourselves. But we definitely have a better understanding of what it means to be an individual today than we did 2,000 years ago. And it was a direct result of the energy of the Antichrist destroying the old ways of thinking, old ways of relating, to allow a new way of thinking and relating to occur. Then that energy was re-released a little over 100 years ago. It started to, and then it stopped in about 1945. So during the time of World War I and World War II was when that energy was released again. And this time it was released through a group of people, through the Axis powers of the Nazis in Germany, the militarists in Japan, and the fascists in Italy. The reason why it was released through a group and not through an individual during that time was because the energies of Aquarius can only be realized in group formation. So it was released through 3 points. Like I said, one in Germany, one in Italy, and one in Japan. But the purpose was the same: to destroy the old ways of thinking and relating, to allow a new way of thinking and relating to occur, which is starting to happen now. We're at the beginning stages of it. But if we were to go back to just 1900, just a little time before the Antichrist energy was released or re-released, we would see a humanity that's totally almost unrelatable than it is today. The prejudices that they had back then, the way that they spoke to one another, the way that they related to one another, the way that they thought about themselves and the world is totally different than it is even to today. And the transformation is probably greater in the ways that we think and relate to one another in the last 100 or so years than it was over the 2,000 years prior to that. A lot of it has to do with Maitreya and the Masters of Wisdom coming back into the everyday world, of course, but it also has to do with that energy. And the energies of Aquarius are totally different than the energies of Pisces. And it will create a whole new civilization on planet Earth that is totally different than what the civilization is today. So, if we could go into the future, or the people in the future could come to now, we would not be able to relate to them, and they would not be able to relate to us. For them, the truth about unity, oneness, brotherhood, cooperation, synthesis, sharing would be a reality for them. They would not be able to understand and relate to somebody who doesn't understand those concepts at all, doesn't live those concepts. So those words that I just mentioned, unity, harmony through diversity, synthesis, cooperation, are literally just words to us today. They mean really little to nothing. But in the future, it will be a way of life for all of humanity, without exception. And if they were to come back to today, they would have no understanding of why we could live in a world where there's such divisions, economically, politically. You know, we're living in a world and allowing injustice to happen all the time, have starvation and poverty, war, terrorism. They would have no concept. Why could you live like this? This is not how you should be living. You know what I'm saying? You shouldn't be living to create as much personal wealth for yourself. You should be living to better the world and yourself, at that time, in that way, right? So their understanding of each other and our understanding of them, we would not be able to relate to them. But we will not create the future world of peace and harmony and oneness without destroying the old ways of thinking and relating, which is the purpose of why the Antichrist energy was released the second time. So those people, and there are a lot of them, and you might be somebody who came across this channel thinking that you were finding the channel of the Antichrist, are really wasting your time. Those people who think Donald Trump is the Antichrist are literally wasting their time talking about it, because he's not the Antichrist. The energy of the Antichrist has already come and gone, already done its work. It's done. And we don't have to worry about it for another 3,000 years. So anyway, hopefully that helps. But like I said, it's a misunderstanding. It's understandable that people think that Maitreya could be the Antichrist because, in their mind, he's different than them. But really what he's talking about is the same thing that Jesus talked about. So anyway, bringing of peace, creation of justice, ending of helping, people who are poverty stricken. These are things that Jesus spoke to the people about that are the same things that Maitreya is speaking about. They're the same thing. But yet people assign him as evil because he doesn't fit into their brand of belief. Does that make sense? But anyway, thanks for the question. Now, the question that I've literally never gotten before, and I don't know if I'll be able to answer correctly, is coming from Anthony. He said, "Hi, Gary, is there any difference between spiritual governance and spiritual government? Is the latter even possible without it becoming exclusive and fanatical?" So, governance, from what I understand, Anthony, is really just the act of governing, right? Government are the individuals that are governing the people, right? I mean, isn't that kind of what it is? Now, if you're talking about, when you say spiritual governance and spiritual government, if you're talking about the Masters of Wisdom, to answer your question, would they ever become fanatical and exclusive? The answer is unequivocally no. And I'll tell you why in just a second. But the concept of inner government or spiritual governance or whatever, that if they're referring to the masters, isn't coming from Benjamin Creme, because he hardly ever used, if ever, used that term in referring to the masters. He referred to them as our elder brothers, as, the masters of wisdom, of course, as the spiritual hierarchy, but he never really referred to them as the inner government. I don't know if Helena Blavatsky referred to them in that way, but I do know that Alice Bailey referred to them quite a bit as the inner government. Now, they do govern humanity in their own way, but, and I'm saying this jokingly, they don't concern themselves with what day the trash pickup is in your town. Is it Tuesday or Thursday, right? They don't concern themselves with that type of governing. They are governing the evolution of humanity and making sure that it's proceeding in a pace, which is, from our perspective, painfully slow, right? But is starting to pick up. They also govern the energies coming in and out of the world and stimulate humanity in the proper proportion and the proper amount by those energies. And they understand the laws of those energies. And that's why they don't give too much energy to this group of people. They might give them a little bit, but not too much, and those kind of things. And that's how they kind of govern. But it is true to say there is a plan for humanity, and that plan comes from an even higher source than even the masters. It comes from God himself. The God of this planet, or the planetary logos, has a plan for this planet. And that plan needs to be implemented. And humanity is so far diverted from that plan because we don't know that there is a plan, and all the commercialization that's going on in the world today, that I'm sure it's frustrating to some degree for these masters, but they are trying to steer us in a different direction, so that we're not living life the way that it is, where we could destroy ourselves, right? But they're part of, they take the plan, and Maitreya and these masters know the long-term plan for humanity, but they have to organize it and divide it up, and then they give it a little bit to this group in humanity and this little scientific discovery that needs to be implemented at that time and so forth. So, for instance, they didn't plant the idea of electricity 2,000 years ago. They only did it just a little over 100 years ago because we wouldn't have been able to do anything with it, in the 13th century, right? We had to kind of build up to that. And then once we got to where we could start to kind of maybe possibly do something with electricity, that's when the idea of electricity came on board, right? The idea of the masters coming back into the everyday world didn't happen until 1875, when they asked Helena Blavatsky to bring that information to the public. They didn't bring it to the public in 1200, or the 5th century. They did it at that time because there were other things that had to be put in place. There were other ways of thinking and relating that had to start to exhibit before we would be able to benefit from that information on whatever level. Does that make sense? But that's their only, that's kind of an oversimplification of it, but that really is how they govern. So they're not governing in the way that we would think a government to govern its people. But the truth is, if you were to look at the spiritual government of actual government of a nation, there is fanaticism, there is exclusivity, there is a form of entitlement and elitism and an injustice there because humanity put it into place that way based on competition and greed. And the governments of the world will be transformed into something totally different than they are today. But we will always have a government in a nation that governs its people in the way that the people want it to be governed. And each nation has a destiny for itself. Each group within that nation has a destiny that must be fulfilled that's different from another nation. But the central truth of the nations is harmony through diversity, or in diversity, excuse me. And not this homogenous type of government that every nation should have the exact same government that the United States has. That's fanaticism, right? So Vietnam will have a different government than China. China will have a different way of governing itself than England, and so forth and so forth and so forth. But the spiritual governments, the inner government of these masters, will be to just guide and help us, keep us from making the missteps, keep us from coming back to the brink of destruction again, and those kind of things. That's how these masters will kind of steer us in the right direction. The day-to-day governance of its people will still be done by the government, but the role of government, the intention of government will be different. It will be for the people and not for a very, very small group of people at the expense of everybody else, which is the way it is today. It won't be competition and geopolitical fights and tensions the way it is today. It will be nations will trust one another. The peoples will then trust those nations better. The propaganda that goes on today that is against another nation that really might not be true, most of the time it isn't true, won't go on anymore. The lies that a nation will tell against another nation because they have a nefarious intention for whatever reason will be gone. There will just be trust amongst the nations. Something totally unbelievable to today, based on what we see today. And it will start with nations taking a little excess that they have and giving it to another nation. That nation paying back what it took by their own resource, or giving it to another nation that might need it. And so forth and so forth and so forth. And just keep doing that over and over and over again. So where everybody's needs taken care of, we all have food, clothing, shelter, healthcare, and education. We all have this sense of uniqueness, this sense of ourselves as divine. We also will have the freedom to be able to create what is inside of us, whether that's a political idea or a spiritual theme or concept, or a form of art, or a form of music, or a form of sculpture, or architecture, or whatever, right? We will create what we are destined to create. We will start to manifest ourselves as souls, and we'll be free. So right now, government is a tyranny. Economics, it's a tyranny around the world with commercialization. It's no mistake that Ben's master referred to commercialization like a monster with its hand on the throat of humanity, squeezing out any creative thought or generous notion, right? And really killing off the vitality of humanity in that way. It's killing the environment. It's a tyranny, right? Well, the economics of the future will not be a tyranny. The economics of the future will give humanity its freedom to be able to explore what it means to be you. Does that make sense? So I don't know if that answers your question or not, Anthony. I'm trying. But anyway, but you get my point. So from the master's point of view, Anthony, they truly love thy neighbor as thyself, which is a Christian truth that has been brought down through the centuries by the churches, right? It's a truth. But yet very few people live its principle. And very few people, tried to think that they could even live to that truth. Or they might think that they're loving thy neighbor as thyself, but they're not. You know what I'm saying? But when we see Maitreya, especially because he's the Lord of love, we'll see what it really means to love thy neighbor as thyself, as Jesus was talking about 2,000 years ago, as Jesus demonstrated 2,000 years ago, and the Buddha demonstrated before him, what it really means to love thy neighbor as thyself. And then we'll really understand what Paul was talking about when he said, owe no man anything but to love them. Because when you love someone, you literally can't covet what they want, what they have. You can't cheat them. You can't lie to them. You can't hurt them or harm them or kill them. You can't do any of those things that Christians refer to as sins. You literally can't sin when you love someone. But how do you love like that? The only way to truly love like that is to see yourself and to realize yourself as you really are, which is the soul, as the self in incarnation. You know what I mean? You can't truly do that until you realize the self, which is what Maitreya says, who and what we really are and what we all share. So when Maitreya says in the New Age prayer, I am the creator of the universe, everything came from me, everything shall return to me, he's not saying that out of arrogance, and he's not exaggerating. That's the truth of who he is, based on what he's realized himself to be as the self. But it's also a truth that you can realize within yourself. And when you say those words, they are actually what you experience. And not just words. And when you truly realize yourself as the self, you love your neighbor truly as the self, which is why they wrote it in the Bible in that way. Which is why these masters, if you're talking about the spiritual governance and the spiritual government of the masters, they can never be fanatical. They can never be exclusive because they manifest perfectly themselves as the self. They've realized themselves as the self. And they manifest their divinity in that way. So there's no chance that they could ever be fanatical in that way or become attached to it. The gift that Maitreya and these masters will give to humanity is the truth that we are the self. The understanding that we will have 2,000 years from now about really what it means to be the self and how to manifest that on planet Earth, how to create political and economic structures that reinforce that truth. That's going to be the difference between the humanity of then and the humanity of now. You know what I mean? But anyway, thank you very much for the question. I love you guys. And I'll try to tackle some of the other things that came my way via text and via email in another video. I love you guys. Thank you very much for talking and listening. And I look forward to putting up videos in the very near future. Have a wonderful day. Hello, my name is Gary Willing. Last year, I started a YouTube channel entitled Search for Signs. Since then, I've put up hundreds of videos talking about politics, economics, the need to save our environment, and so forth, and tying it into UFOs, crop circles, strange phenomena, of course, healing waters, crosses of light, and those kind of things. Talk about why and how they're all connected. Well, what do I mean? I think that all those signs are pointing to the fact that the one awaited by all the world's religions, his name is Maitreya, is already on TV speaking directly to humanity. Talk about the need for peace through sharing the world's resources, and of course the need to SOP, save our planet. If you want to find out more information about Maitreya and the Masters of Wisdom and how it's all connected into what's going on today, go to YouTube and look at Search for Signs.